Ever find yourself, really pondering the meaning of words like virtue or courage, like what they really mean, not just the dictionary definition?
Yeah, like they point to something deeper about being human.
Exactly. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. These foundational questions that philosophers have been grappling with forever, especially through the lens of Socrates, specifically how he's presented in Plato's early ethical works.
Right, we've got this amazing set of those shorter ethical dialogues of Plato, a real, I think, intimate look at Socrates in action, wrestling with, these concepts of virtue.
And these early works are widely considered, like our sources point out, a pretty reliable picture of the actual historical Socrates.
Yeah, and it's worth noting this Socrates, the one we see here, is a bit different from the Socrates in Plato's later dialogues, especially in how he thinks about the soul.
Here, he's treating the soul as a unity. So I guess our mission for this deep dive is to really get a handle on Socrates' method, his philosophical approach. What were the questions he was asking about virtue and how we should live?
Exactly. How should we live? Big question, right?
Huge. And we've got some great material here from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to help us unpack it all.
Yeah, a scholarly overview. We'll be diving into some key Socratic concepts, exploring his interactions with figures like the sophists.
Okay, so the first thing that probably comes to mind when we think about Socrates is that famous method of his, the Elenchus.
Of course, the Elenchus.
Can we just break that down for a second, remind everyone what exactly that is?
Sure. So the Elenchus is basically this really rigorous form of questioning, this philosophical examination. And Socrates' partner, the person he's talking to, they have to answer based on their own beliefs.
So it's about getting them to articulate what they already think they know.
Right. And then the standard for judging those claims, it comes from the interlocutor themselves. Their own admissions are what determine the outcome.
Okay, so Socrates uses their own statements to, like, test if those ideas actually hold up.
Exactly. He'll often start with a claim his partner makes, often about, their understanding of a virtue or how wise they think they are.
And then what? Does he, like, immediately challenge that, or?
Sometimes he'll push for clarification right away, but sometimes he'll start asking questions to get them to agree to a series of premises. And this is where it gets interesting. Those premises often end up contradicting that initial claim the person made.
So he's kind of building an argument, but using the other person's own beliefs as the building blocks, and then boom, they've contradicted themselves.
Exactly. And sometimes, to get them to agree to those key premises, he uses something called epigoge.
Epigoge.
Yeah, think of it like when you see a pattern in a bunch of different examples and draw a general conclusion. Socrates did that, appealed to that intuition to support his premises.
Interesting. So what's the typical outcome of this kind of Socratic interrogation?
Well, usually the person ends up feeling, let's just say, uncomfortable.
Right, they can't defend what they thought they knew.
Yeah, they find themselves unable to logically support what they were so sure of. And this leads to a state called aporia.
Aporia. So for a philosopher, this is like hitting a wall, right? An impasse.
Yeah, exactly. You're stuck. You realize your understanding wasn't what you thought it was.
And that, I think, ties directly to Socrates' claim in the Apology about examining those who thought they were wise.
Right, and finding that none of them really were. And the Elenchus was the tool for that examination.
But the big debate is whether this method actually leads to, any solid conclusions.
Yeah. Does it actually help us find truth? Or is it just about showing how confused we are?
Right. Is it constructive or just destructive? Big question for philosophers.
Absolutely. And along with this questioning, we also see Socrates constantly trying to define things. What is X?
Always asking, what is X?
Whether X is piety, courage, anything.
But he wasn't just looking for any old definition, right?
No, he had some very specific requirements for what would count as a good answer.
No.
Okay, so first, it had to be general. Apply to every single instance of, whatever X is. Second, it had to be exclusive. Apply only to instances of X.
Okay, so it can't be too broad or too narrow.
Right. And third, and this is key, it had to explain why something is X.
So not just describing features, but getting to the essence of what it is.
Exactly. And the Euthyphro dialogue is a great example of this.
Euthyphro, yeah.
Socrates is after the ousia, the essence of the thing, not just the path, the non-essential attributes.
Can you give an example of that for, those of us thinking about this philosophically?
Sure. In the Euthyphro says, piety is what all the gods love. But Socrates says that's just a pathos.
It's a result of piety, not the definition of it.
Exactly. It's like saying a triangle is something mathematicians like. It might be true, but it doesn't tell you what a triangle is.
Okay, I see the difference. And you said there was another requirement, something about synonymy.
Yes. The idea is that whatever explains Xness has to always be X itself. So, like, if you're defining the fine, you can't point to something that's only sometimes fine.
Because then that thing wouldn't be the real explanation of fineness. Like fire always causes heat because fire itself is always hot.
Precisely. So he set a really high bar for what counts as a definition.
Did he ever find one that he was actually happy with?
That's a big debate. Some scholars think he did, others don't.
If he found these perfect definitions, I guess that would mean he had that expert knowledge of virtue that he always said he didn't have.
Exactly. So either he genuinely didn't find satisfying answers, or maybe his saying, "I know nothing," was a bit, well, ironic.
Interesting. So even in his pursuit of knowledge, he maintained this kind of intellectual humility.
At least publicly, which is, a significant point to consider when studying him.
Absolutely. Now, this whole idea of needing definitions, it implies that you need to know what something is before you can know other things about it.
Right. Socrates seemed to think that knowing the definition came first. Like, you need to know what piety is before you can say whether an action is pious.
But there's that critique, the Socratic fallacy.
Yeah, Peter Geach pointed that out. He argued that Socrates himself seemed to know things about virtues, even when he couldn't define them perfectly.
So it's like recognizing a bird without knowing the official species name.
Right. Maybe we can understand things on some level, even without a perfect, philosophically rigorous definition.
Right. And our source also mentions that the texts don't always explicitly say this is what Socrates believed. So it's up for debate.
Right. Maybe a more charitable interpretation is that he just thought this strict definition thing was necessary for techna, for expert knowledge.
That makes sense. Like a craftsman needs to know the precise definition of his tools.
Exactly. And he clearly had his own opinions about virtues that were guiding his search. He knew what he was looking for, even if he didn't always find it.
Okay, let's talk about virtue itself.
Right.
What did our aurorate, virtue actually mean to Socrates in an ethical sense?
So while our Socrate could just mean any kind of excellence, Socrates focused on ethical virtue. And he really emphasized the analogy between virtue in the soul and health in the body.
So like a healthy soul versus a sick soul.
Exactly. And for him, virtue is basically the ability to do good and avoid doing bad. And wrong actions, he thought, actually harm the soul.
He talks about that in the Credo, right?
Yeah, he says that doing wrong actually damages a part of you, not just, brings external consequences.
So it's not just about what other people think, but about this internal spiritual damage.
Precisely. And since he thought the soul was way more important than the body, he believed nothing mattered more than virtue.
The health of your soul.
Exactly. And he saw his role in Athens as like this philosophical gadfly, always trying to get people to think about this.
To care for their souls.
Yes. Now, when he was investigating these virtues, courage, piety, wisdom, temperance, justice, did he see them as, separate things or all connected?
Right, because our source mentions this idea that virtues have a status as entities for Socrates.
Yeah, especially in dialogues like the Euthyphro and the Hippias Major, there's this assumption that virtues are something real, almost like independent things. Some scholars even see this as a precursor to Plato's theory of forms.
Interesting. And the main virtues he explored, they're often presented as connected to wisdom.
And yeah, maybe even dependent on it.
Which brings us to this fascinating idea, the unity of virtue. So he's saying that the virtues aren't really separate things at all.
It's a radical claim, and he argues for it in the Protagoras.
So how do philosophers interpret that?
There are a few different views. Gregory Vlastos, he had this idea that if you have one virtue, you have all of them.
So they always come together.
Right. But others think it's even stronger than that. They think the definitions of all the virtues share the same essence.
Wow. So it's not just that they occur together, but they're basically the same thing, just different aspects of it.
Exactly. And it's interesting because the dialogues about defining individual virtues, they seem to assume they're different. But then they often run into these dead ends that suggest they're all connected.
Right, like trying to define courage in the Protagoras as knowledge of what to fear and not fear.
And then in the Laches, a similar definition is rejected.
So much philosophical tension there.
Definitely. And then in the Euthyphro, there's that impasse when they try to separate piety from justice.
It's like they can't be completely separated.
Exactly. It's like imagine trying to define different parts of a healthy body.
Like strong muscles versus healthy lungs.
They're all part of the same overall health.
Makes sense. Now let's talk about this techne analogy.
Techne!
Yeah. Socrates often compared virtue to techne, what our source translates as expert knowledge.
Ah,
So
yes.
for our philosopher listeners, we're talking about things like navigation or medicine.
Right. Learnable, teachable skills.
So what makes someone an expert? Someone who possesses techne.
Well, ideally, they can point to their teachers and their students. They've mastered their whole field,
Hmm.
and they can clearly say what the goal of their profession is.
Okay, so it's not just about knowing a bunch of facts, but also about, like, having a deep understanding of the field.
And being able to articulate it. And techne is rational. It's based on principles and definitions that, hold up under scrutiny.
So when Socrates compares virtue to techne, what's he getting at?
He seems to be playing with the idea that virtue is a kind of knowledge, specifically knowing how to live well, how to take care of your soul.
So if virtue is like techne, it should be teachable, right?
In theory, yeah. But Socrates himself had some doubts about whether virtue could actually be taught. We see that in the Protagoras.
So was he really convinced by this analogy, or was he using it more as a tool in his arguments?
Lots of scholars think it was a tool, a way to challenge those sophists who said they could teach virtue, especially since Sophia, which is often translated as wisdom, could also mean techne.
Interesting. It really complicates the picture.
It does.
Okay, so this idea of virtue as knowledge is, crucial to understanding Socrates. What do philosophers call that?
Socratic intellectualism.
Socratic intellectualism. And there are different interpretations of that, right?
Yeah, lots of different views. Some think that the only way to harm the soul is through ignorance, making bad judgments.
So knowledge is the key to a healthy soul.
Right, but others say moral injury is more about disrupting the soul's order, its inner unity.
So it's not just about what you know, but about the state of your soul itself.
Yeah, and then there are those who think it's both.
A bit of both.
Yeah, and for Socrates, a healthy soul, sophron, is not just about controlling yourself.
It's more about being whole, undivided.
Exactly. Now, this connects to another big Socratic idea, akrasia, or weakness of will.
Yeah, this is a tricky one.
Socrates thought that if you really know what's right, you can't be overcome by pleasure or passion.
But that's not how it feels in real life.
Yeah.
Right. We often know what's right and do the wrong thing anyway.
Yeah. But he argued that the common explanation for that, that pleasure overpowers knowledge, doesn't make sense.
He lays this out in the Protagoras, right?
He does. He uses the analogy of techne again. A true expert doesn't just abandon their knowledge because they feel like it.
Right, like a doctor wouldn't just forget their training because they're tempted to do something unethical.
Exactly. So, for Socrates, if you do something wrong, it must be because you didn't really know the right thing to do.
So no one errs voluntarily, right? Every wrong action is due to ignorance.
That's the idea. Which means the solution to wrongdoing isn't punishment, but education.
Help them learn what they didn't know.
Right. But there's also that interesting counterpoint in the Hippias Minor.
Yeah, where he argues it's better to do wrong intentionally than out of ignorance.
Yeah, which is a bit of a head-scratcher.
It really is. And he even says he doesn't like this conclusion.
He does. So you can see how complex his thinking was.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, we can't talk about Socrates without talking about the Sophists.
Right. They were a big deal back then.
They were these traveling teachers who taught all sorts of things, rhetoric especially.
And some even claimed to teach virtue.
But Socrates wasn't a fan, right?
No, not really. He saw it as his mission to challenge those claims.
We see that in dialogues like the Euthydemus, the Hippias dialogues, the Protagoras.
Yeah, there was this idea that sophists taught people how to make bad arguments sound good.
So Socrates saw himself as this, genuine seeker of truth, not someone trying to manipulate people with fancy words.
Exactly. So let's dive into some of these key dialogues, starting with the apology.
Socrates' defense at his trial.
A powerful speech, and really unique in that he seems more concerned with telling the truth than getting off the hook.
Right. He addresses the charges against him, corrupting the youth and all that, but he connects them back to these older accusations from Aristophanes' play, The Clouds.
Or they made fun of him for, talking about natural science and teaching rhetoric for bad reasons.
But Socrates says he's not interested in those things.
No, he says he doesn't care about detailed natural science or teaching people how to be tricky with words.
He says he lives the way he does because of a divine mission from Apollo. He sees himself as this gadfly annoying people into thinking about virtue.
Exactly. And he tells that famous story about the Oracle of Delphi.
Right, where he learns that no one is truly wise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He concludes that real wisdom belongs to the god and that his own wisdom is just knowing that he doesn't know everything.
He's very clear about that.
He is. And interestingly, in the Apology, he doesn't say much about the afterlife.
Yeah, which is different from what he says in other dialogues,
Very different. Okay, so after the Apology, we have the Credo.
where he's in prison and his friend Crito wants to help him escape.
Yeah, Credo has this whole plan worked out.
But Socrates refuses.
He says it's never right to do wrong, even if someone has wronged you.
So even though he was unjustly condemned, he won't do something unjust to escape.
Right. He argues that escaping would be like betraying the laws of Athens. He even personifies the laws, giving them a voice.
That's a powerful image.
It is. But it does seem a bit at odds with what he said in the Apology about disobeying the court if they told him to stop philosophizing.
Yeah, it raises some questions about obedience and conscience.
Hmm.
Okay, let's move on to the dialogues about definitions, like the Euthyphro.
The Euthyphro, yes, all about defining piety.
In Socrates, he runs into Euthyphro, who's about to prosecute his own father.
For murder.
Socrates is intrigued by this. He wants to know how Euthyphro can be so sure that this is the pious thing to do.
So he asks him to define piety.
And they go through a bunch of definitions, right?
They do. But each one fails to be general enough, exclusive enough, or really explain what piety is.
Even the idea that piety is what all the gods love, that doesn't work.
No, because it's just describing something that's true of pious actions, not explaining what makes them pious.
Right, the gods love pious actions because they're pious, not the other way around.
Exactly. So they end up in aporia. No clear definition.
Which maybe hints at this idea that piety can't really be separated from other virtues, like justice.
Right, and it shows how hard it is to go beyond just like religious tradition and find a real philosophical understanding of these concepts.
Okay, what about the Charmites?
That one tackles sophrosyne.
Which is often translated as temperance or self-control.
Right, but it's more about having a healthy, unified soul.
So they're trying to define what it means to have that kind of inner harmony.
And they consider all sorts of definitions: quietness, shame, minding your own business.
But none of them really work.
And then they get into this idea of sophrosyne as knowledge, maybe self-knowledge.
But Socrates isn't so sure about that either.
No, he questions whether such knowledge is even possible or if it would be good to have.
But he does suggest that the best kind of knowledge would be knowing good and evil.
Which, again, connects virtue to wisdom. And, of course, there's that historical irony with Charmides and Critias later becoming, tyrants.
Yeah, not very soft front of them. Okay, on to the Laches. All about courage.
This one's interesting because it goes beyond the typical battlefield idea of courage.
They talk about courage at sea, courage in illness, even courage in politics.
Exactly. And Socrates, he pushes Laches and Nicias, these two generals, to define courage.
And, as usual, they run into trouble.
They do. Laches tries saying courage is standing your ground in battle, but Socrates brings up strategic retreats.
Right.
Then Laches says it's endurance, but that raises the question of whether it's wise endurance or just stubbornness.
Right. If it's wise, it seems like it needs knowledge.
Exactly. And Nicias jumps on that. He says courage is knowing what to fear and what not to fear.
So knowing future good and evil.
Yeah. But then Socrates says that sounds like it's just all of virtue, not just courage.
Another impasse.
As usual. And it raises the question of whether you can really separate courage from other virtues or from wisdom in general.
So maybe more support for the unity of virtue. Okay, let's talk about the Hippias Major, even though there's debate about whether it's really by Plato.
Right, but it's still a fascinating philosophical exploration all about defining kalon.
Kaikolon.
Yeah, it's this word that encompasses beauty, nobility, goodness.
And Hippias, he's the sophist in this one, right?
Yeah, and he's pretty confident, offering all these different definitions.
Like a beautiful woman, gold, living a virtuous life.
And Socrates, or actually his unnamed questioner, shoots them all down.
Not general enough, not exclusive enough, not explanatory enough.
Right, and then they get into more abstract ideas, like the fitting, the useful, the beneficial, even pleasure.
But those don't work either.
No. But there are hints in there that the fine might be connected to the good and the beneficial.
But ultimately, they end in aporia again.
Yeah. It shows how hard it is to define these fundamental concepts. And there's this interesting suggestion that good things might be good because they produce more good things.
Okay, and then there's the Hippias Minor.
Which asks this crazy question: is it better to do wrong intentionally or unintentionally?
That's a tough one.
It is. And Socrates ends up arguing that it's better to do wrong on purpose.
Really?
Yeah, his reasoning is that if you can do something wrong intentionally, it means you know how to do the right thing.
So you're not just ignorant, you're making a choice.
Exactly. But even Socrates admits he doesn't like this conclusion.
Right. It goes against his usual thinking.
It does, but it really highlights how complex these issues of intention, knowledge, and moral responsibility are,
It does. Okay, on to the Euthydemus.
where we see the contrast between Socratic philosophy and sophistry,
So we've got Socrates and then these two sophists, Euthydemus and Dionysodus.
who claim they can teach virtue.
And they use all these like tricky arguments and logical fallacies.
Yeah, but Socrates patiently dismantles them, and then he tries to show how to genuinely pursue virtue and wisdom.
And he suggests that they're closely connected, right?
Very closely. He argues that wisdom is the greatest good, and that everything else is only good if it's guided by wisdom.
And they talk about this kingly art, right?
Yeah, like the ultimate techne, but they can't really define what that would be.
So again, an inconclusive ending.
It is. But it leaves us thinking about what real education is and how it's different from just manipulating words.
Okay, finally, the big one, the Protagoras.
This dialogue has it all.
The central question is whether virtue can be taught.
And Protagoras, he's all for it. He gives this big speech about how important virtue is for society and how we learn it through social customs and education.
But Socrates isn't so sure.
Right. And they get into all these arguments about the unity of virtue, the relationship between virtue and pleasure, and Socrates' idea that you can't knowingly do wrong.
So it brings together a lot of what we've been talking about.
It does. And in the end, there's no clear resolution. But it really shows how complex these questions about virtue, knowledge, and motivation are.
Absolutely. And it's amazing how these questions from ancient Greece are still relevant to philosophers today.
They really are. These ideas about virtue, knowledge, the good life, they're timeless. And we're still debating a lot of what Socrates said.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought. How can you apply Socrates' questioning to your own beliefs? What resonated with you most from this discussion?
Because these dialogues are more than just history, they challenge us to think critically about ourselves and what we believe.
If you want to explore these ideas further, definitely check out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
They have a great entry on the Socratic method and on all these individual dialogues, and there are tons of books and articles by scholars who are still wrestling with these questions today.
So keep questioning, keep exploring, and thanks for joining us for this deep dive.